Well, let's look at Moses' encounter. Because all of us have had crisis. And what Moses went through is a crisis. And there's other crises throughout the Scriptures that are clearly defined, just like this crisis with Moses. But Moses' encounter was with God, folks. There's no doubt about it. And when God just spoke to Moses, Moses did what? Just like Mike read this morning in the book of Exodus. Moses began to make excuses. How many times have you used these same excuses that Moses used? Let's define those excuses just a little bit. Moses said, well, God, who am I? I'm not well known enough. I don't have enough influence. I don't have any of these things. God, I'm not ready for this, God. God wouldn't ask Moses if he was ready. Do you believe God was smart enough to know if Moses was ready or not? Sure he was. Do you think God knows you well enough to know what he can do with you if you'll surrender your life to him? Absolutely he does. Do you think God needs your permission to understand that? No, he doesn't. But if you don't join God in what God is asking you to do in your life, then folks, you're going to ask God, you're going to give God excuses when it comes time to step out with God. The second excuse he gave was, how can I answer this question about who has sent me, Lord? You know, they'll laugh at me. They won't understand these things. Well, sure, the world doesn't understand godly things. But when he stood before Pharaoh and he finally allowed God to use him like he wanted to, he said, you just tell Pharaoh that I am that I am. I'm everything in every circumstance. Wow, what an answer. He didn't ask Moses to explain God to Pharaoh. He just asked him to declare God before Pharaoh. He wasn't up to debate at this issue. And when God is moving us, we don't have to apologize for what God is doing in our life. Now, people sometimes are going to think you're a little whacked. That's okay. I've been a little whacked a long time. But I'd rather be a little wacky doing what God is asking me to do than I would to be really, really, in agreement with everybody. Because, the Bible simply says, woe unto everybody man speaks good of. It does, doesn't it? What's he talking about? Well, if you follow God, folks, not everybody's going to agree with you on everything. I understand that. And if you don't agree with me, you have the absolute right, according to God, to be wrong. Okay, that's a bad, okay. No, at that point. No, we're that way, aren't we? But he made that excuse. Then he asked this question, well, God, what if they don't believe me? And what if they doubt you? And what if they don't trust you like I do? Well, do you think everybody in the world is going to believe everything that God says every moment of every day? Do you? You've read it maybe. I hope you have. But God has revealed himself to us. Yet, when Moses, a man that God was working in his life, made excuses, well, you know what he was doing? He was questioning what God was saying. He was doing that. And then he came down to that last one. Well, I don't talk well. Somebody else could do this better than I could do this. How many of you have ever used that excuse? Preacher, go find somebody else because they could do a better job than I could. How about that one? Listen, let me tell you something about this. If God is putting you in a position and God has something he wants you to do, he wants you to join him in what he is doing because he knows that you're the one for that position. You're the one for that job. You're the one he wants to use. He doesn't want to use that other person. If he didn't want to use that other person, he would already talk to that other person. You see? What you believe about what God says and what you believe about what God does at this point is going to define you. Isn't there somebody else that can do this, God? If you just have to have me, how many times have I ever heard this in churches? Well, preacher, if you can't find somebody else to do it, I'll do it. Well, it don't work very well, folks. If God is leading us into something, we ought to be excited about what God can and wants to do in our life. But Moses made excuses just like we make excuses. Now, what was God's reaction to Moses? Well, I'll tell you what God's reaction was. He was displeased with Moses' excuses. Just like he is displeased at our excuses while we give priority to things other than what God is doing. Now, when God reveals his purpose and his plan, he is inviting you folks. He is inviting you to join him in what he is doing. God knows what's going on. And at this point, at the point where God invites you to join him in this experience with him, in your daily walk, in everything, folks, let me tell you what it's going to do. Every one of those excuses, Moses was trying to define his inability. But the problem was that Moses was not trusting God. And every excuse Moses made said a whole lot more about what he believed about God than it did about him. And when we make excuses and when we refuse to walk with God and to do the things that God has asked us to do, it doesn't make God any smaller. It doesn't make God any less believable. It doesn't make God any more God, any less God. What it does, it defines what I really believe about God. It's not a test of God's character. It is not a test of God's power. It is not a test of God's ability. Folks, it's a test of what I believe about God. That's the turning point. And the turning point really comes down to this. Will I, or do I, trust God enough to join God in what he is asking me to do? Will I give my whole heart in life? Did I really trust Jesus with my life? Is he really Lord of my life? Folks, this is a crisis of belief. It is. And a crisis is defined as when you have a decision to make that will ultimately alter the rest of your life. It will. And that's what happens. And this crisis is a crisis of belief, folks. Now, I think there's some things we need to understand about the moment of a crisis of belief. The first of those things I want to talk with you about is an encounter with God requires faith. It does. It requires faith. That kind of encounter with God, just like Moses had there, it wasn't, let me think about it a while, God. It either requires the faith to believe God and believe in what God can do, instead of making excuses about what you believe you can't do. Now, what is faith? The best definition of faith in whatever translation you have today is found in Hebrews 11:1. The King James translates, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And for by it the elders obtained a good report. The Holman Christian Standard, which I use more often now, simply defines it. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. Folks, it is the ability to take a step beyond where you've ever stepped before, knowing that if you're joining God in what he's doing, that you cannot fail in that place. How many of you have ever came right up to the edge of your comfort zone and then was afraid to take that one more step because it was really uncomfortable? How many of you have ever wanted to witness to one of your friends or talk about Jesus, and you talked about everything in the world, and all of a sudden this little place was opened up, and you had the perfect place, and God just opened this up, and you have been praying about this person's salvation or relationship with God, and you had the opportunity, it was open, and you knew it, and all of a sudden you changed the subject. I'm not going to ask you to hold up your hand, because I dare say if any of you are serious about your friend's relationship with God and your family's relationship with God, you've been there. You've been there. And afterwards, how did you feel when you didn't go forward with that? You thought, oh man, why did I do that? I missed that. There was a crisis at that point. God had set it up. Now, faith is the reality of what you had desired for, you hoped for. It's reality, folks. It is when those things you've prayed for, those things that you've thought about, those things that you said, oh God, give me this opportunity, and all of a sudden the opportunity is there, and do you step out into that opportunity?